Somewhere right now, there's a version of you that already quit on a goal before you even wrote it down. Not because it was impossible. Because a voice in your head said, "Let's be realistic," and you listened to it like it was wisdom. Here's the uncomfortable part. That voice was never protecting you. It was just protecting your comfort zone, and it's been costing you for years. Most people think success is about talent, timing, or luck. It's not. There's a book that quietly took that idea apart decades ago, and it still holds up better than half the advice floating around today. It's built on one blunt claim: the size of your success is decided long before you take a single action, in the size of what you let yourself believe. Small thinking isn't caution. It's a ceiling you built yourself and forgot you installed. In this one, we're going deep into that idea. Why belief works like a self-fulfilling machine. Why the excuses you think are logical are actually just fear wearing a disguise. Why confidence never shows up first. And what actually separates people who build big lives from people who just talk about it. Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to look at your own realistic goals very differently. This is Gollari Books. Chapter 1. Belief comes before the evidence. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why do two people with almost identical skill, education, and starting conditions end up in completely different places 10 years later? Same intelligence. Same opportunities on paper. Wildly different outcomes. If it's not talent and it's not luck, what is it? The uncomfortable answer is that we don't act based on what's actually possible. We act based on what we believe is possible. That's not a motivational poster line. It's closer to a mechanical fact about how humans operate. Your brain doesn't run a background calculation of what could I realistically achieve. It runs on what do I already believe about myself, and then it filters every opportunity, every risk, every hard conversation through that filter. Two people can look at the exact same job opening. One applies. One scrolls past it, already having decided, before reading the requirements, that it's out of their league. The job didn't change. The belief did. Here's why this claim is worth taking more seriously than it might sound at first, since on the surface it can seem like an oversimplification of something more complicated. Nobody's disputing that actual skill, actual resources, and actual circumstances matter. They obviously do. The point isn't that belief overrides reality entirely. It's that belief determines which parts of reality you even engage with in the first place. A skilled person who believes the opportunity isn't for them never puts their actual skill in front of the decision maker at all. Their skill was real. It just never got the chance to matter, because belief decided, upstream of everything else, that the attempt wasn't worth making. This is why belief functions almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's worth understanding the actual mechanism instead of just accepting it as a nice idea. When you believe something is achievable, your attention changes first. You start noticing resources, people, and openings you would have filtered out before, because your brain is now actively scanning for confirmation instead of scanning for reasons to stay safe. Your energy changes next. Belief removes the constant low-grade drain of internally arguing with yourself about whether something is worth attempting. And your behavior changes last, but most visibly. You send the email. You ask the question in the meeting. You show up to the audition. None of that requires the outcome to be guaranteed. It only requires you to believe the attempt is worth making. Think about someone learning to negotiate their salary for the first time. Two candidates, same offer on the table. One has quietly decided, before the conversation even starts, that asking for more is greedy or that they'll be seen as difficult. So their voice gets smaller, their ask gets smaller, and they leave money on the table that was never actually off the table. It just felt that way. The other candidate walked in believing the number was negotiable because that's simply what professionals do. Same company, same budget, same manager on the other side of the table. Different belief, different outcome, and neither candidate did anything the other one was incapable of doing. It's worth being specific about why belief changes attention in such a concrete, almost mechanical way, rather than just accepting it as a vague truism. Human attention is selective by necessity. There's simply too much information available in any given environment to consciously process all of it, so the brain constantly filters, keeping what seems relevant and discarding the rest before it even reaches conscious awareness. What counts as relevant is heavily shaped by existing belief. If you believe a certain kind of opportunity isn't available to you, your filtering system quietly deprioritizes information related to it, not out of malice, simply because it's been tagged as irrelevant. Change the underlying belief, and the exact same environment, the same conversations, the same headlines, the same rooms, suddenly contains visibly more relevant material than it did the week before, even though nothing external actually changed. The opportunities were there the whole time. The filter just wasn't built to notice them yet. Now picture belief as something closer to a thermostat than a light switch. A light switch is binary, on or off, confident or not. A thermostat sets the entire climate of a room without you having to consciously manage every degree. Your dominant belief about your own capability sets the climate for how you show up in 100 small decisions a week, most of which you never consciously notice you're making, because you've already decided the temperature. There's a reason the thermostat image is worth sitting with a little longer than it first seems to deserve. Nobody adjusts a thermostat by staring at it and trying to feel warmer. They adjust the actual setting, and the room follows. Most people try to change their sense of what's possible by staring directly at the feeling, trying to will themselves into feeling more capable through sheer effort of positive thinking in the moment. That rarely works, for the same reason staring at a thermostat doesn't warm a room. What actually works is adjusting the setting itself, the underlying assumption running in the background, usually through small, repeated evidence rather than a single moment of willpower, and letting the felt sense of capability follow from that adjustment rather than trying to produce it directly. Here's the part that's easy to miss. Belief doesn't wait for proof. It comes first. People assume they'll believe in themselves once they've achieved something that justifies it, once there's a track record, once there's evidence. But that's backwards, and it's exactly why so many people stay stuck. If you're waiting for evidence before you allow yourself to believe, you'll never take the action that would have generated the evidence in the first place. Belief has to come before the result, not after it, because belief is what produces the behavior that produces the result. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a decision right now, starting the side project, asking for the promotion, signing up for the course that scares you a little. What if the only thing actually stopping you isn't the market, isn't your resume, isn't your bank account, but a belief you inherited years ago and never bothered to question? What would you attempt this month if you genuinely believed you were capable of pulling it off? There's a version of this that shows up constantly in ordinary workplaces, far away from anything as dramatic as inventing an airplane. Picture two co-workers, same department, same manager, same years of experience on paper. A new project comes up, bigger than anything either of them has led before. One of them hears about it and quietly assumes it's not for them yet, that someone more senior will obviously take it, and so they never even mention their interest out loud. The other hears about the exact same project and assumes, without much evidence either way, that they could probably figure it out if given the shot, so they ask for it directly. 9 times out of 10, the project goes to whoever asked. Not because they were more qualified on paper, because belief turned into a specific, visible action, and the other person's belief never got the chance to. This is worth sitting with, because it exposes something uncomfortable about how opportunity actually gets distributed in the real world. It's rarely handed out to whoever is secretly the most capable. It's handed out to whoever positions themselves, out loud, as someone capable of handling it. And that positioning is downstream of belief, not the other way around. You don't get offered the stretch project because you feel ready. You get offered it because you acted like someone who was, and the acting only happens if the belief came first. Here's a final way to make this land before moving forward. Think about how often you've watched someone less experienced than you get an opportunity you quietly assumed you'd get first, and think honestly about whether the actual difference was skill, or simply the fact that they raised their hand and you didn't. That's not a comfortable question, but it's a genuinely useful one, because it points directly at the lever that's actually within your control this week, regardless of how the last several opportunities happen to play out. It's also worth being precise about what belief is not. It's not the same as certainty. Believing you're capable of pulling something off doesn't mean you're guaranteed to succeed, and it doesn't require you to pretend the outcome is a sure thing. It's closer to believing you're capable of handling whatever the process throws at you along the way, including the parts that don't go as planned. That distinction matters, because a lot of people reject the whole idea of believing bigger because they misread it as toxic positivity or denial. It isn't. It's simply a working assumption that you're equipped to figure out the next step, whatever that step turns out to be, rather than a guarantee that every step will be smooth. Here's another angle worth considering. Belief compounds the same way debt or savings compound, quietly in the background, whether or not you're paying attention to it. Every time you act in line with a small belief and it goes reasonably well, that belief gets slightly more solid, and it becomes marginally easier to act on a slightly bigger version of it next time. Every time you act in line with a limiting belief, the opposite happens. That belief gets marginally more solid too, and the next opportunity gets filtered out just a little more automatically than the one before it. Neither direction requires a dramatic event. Both directions run quietly in the background, across ordinary weeks, until one day the gap between two people who started in similar places looks enormous, even though it was built one small, repeated decision at a time. Here's a specific way to notice which direction your own belief has been compounding lately, without needing months of hindsight to see it. Look back over the last handful of small decisions where you had a genuine choice between the slightly bolder option and the safer one, an offer to speak up, an invitation you almost declined, a small ask you almost didn't make. Not the big, obvious life decisions, the small, easy-to-forget ones. The pattern across those small choices, more than any single big decision, is usually the most honest signal available of which direction your belief has actually been trending, regardless of what you'd say about yourself if asked directly. There's also a specific reason this pattern is worth catching early rather than late. Course-correcting a belief that's compounded in the wrong direction for 6 months is a meaningfully different task than course-correcting one that's compounded that way for 6 years, not because the underlying mechanism changes, but because 6 years produces a much thicker stack of confirming small evidence for the brain to work through and dismiss before a new pattern can take hold. This isn't a reason for urgency or panic. Belief can be redirected at any stage. It's simply a reason the small, easy-to-overlook decisions this week matter more than they feel like they do in the moment. Here's one more angle worth sitting with before moving on, because it explains why belief is so much harder to install after the fact than it is to protect early. Children before a certain age tend to believe almost anything is available to them, not out of naivety exactly, but because they simply haven't yet been given enough realistic feedback to build a ceiling. Somewhere along the way, most people accumulate enough of that feedback that the ceiling forms, quietly, without a single dramatic moment marking when it happened. Which means the work of thinking bigger, for most adults, isn't really about installing something new. It's about identifying which parts of that accumulated ceiling were ever actually load-bearing, and which parts were just assumptions nobody ever tested. Consider the specific experience of learning a new skill as an adult, something like an instrument, a language, or a technical craft, where the beginner phase is unavoidably clumsy and visible. Most adults quit far earlier in that process than the actual difficulty of the skill would justify, not because the skill turned out to be harder than expected, but because the belief required to tolerate being visibly bad at something for a while ran out before the skill had a chance to develop. The people who stick with it long enough to get good at it aren't necessarily more talented at the skill itself. They're usually just running on a belief that being bad now doesn't say anything permanent about their eventual ceiling, and that specific belief is what buys them the additional months everyone else quits before reaching. This is the foundation everything else builds on. Not blind optimism, not pretending obstacles don't exist, just a quiet working assumption that you are capable of figuring things out. And once that foundation is in place, the next thing worth confronting is the word people use to keep that belief small in the first place. That word is realistic, and it deserves a much closer look than most people ever give it. Chapter 2: Why realistic is usually just another word for limited somewhere in your life. Someone who meant well told you to be realistic. Maybe it was a parent, a teacher, a well-intentioned friend. And here's the thing worth questioning. What did they actually mean by that? In almost every case, realistic doesn't mean accurate. It means safe. It means don't reach for something that might not work out and make me watch you fail. It's advice built to protect the advice giver's comfort, dressed up as protecting yours. Most people spend their entire lives operating inside walls they never built consciously. Nobody sat them down and said, "Here is the ceiling of what you're allowed to want." Instead, it happened in 100 small moments, 100 small let's be realistic comments, until the walls felt like they were just the shape of reality itself, rather than a shape someone else drew. Here's a way to actually locate some of those walls, since they're hard to see precisely because they've never felt like walls. They felt like simple facts about yourself. Try finishing this sentence honestly, several times, with whatever comes to mind first. People like me don't usually. Whatever fills that blank, whether it's about money, visibility, leadership, creative work, or anything else, is worth examining closely, because it's rarely an actual fact. It's usually a summary of what you've personally observed so far, mistaken for a permanent rule about what's possible. Here's the mechanism worth understanding. What people call being realistic is almost always a description of the past, not a prediction of the future. When someone says a goal is unrealistic, they usually mean people like us don't usually do that, or I've never seen it happen in my circle. That's a statement about precedent, not about possibility. And precedent is exactly the thing every person who ever did something new had to ignore. Thinking big isn't about ignoring reality. It's about expanding your definition of it. Small thinking keeps you circling the same safe, predictable track, because a small track feels manageable and controllable. Big thinking pushes you into territory you haven't mapped yet, which feels uncomfortable precisely because it's unfamiliar, not because it's actually more dangerous than it looks. Here's a distinction worth adding between unfamiliar and unsafe, since the two get conflated constantly, and that conflation does a lot of the quiet damage. Unfamiliar just means you haven't built a mental map of it yet, and the discomfort that comes with unfamiliarity is simply the sensation of navigating without a map, nothing more sinister than that. Unsafe means there's an actual identifiable risk of real harm. The two produce a nearly identical internal sensation, the same tightness, the same hesitation, which is exactly why unfamiliar territory so often gets mistakenly filed under unsafe and avoided accordingly. Learning to pause and ask which one you're actually feeling, before deciding whether caution is warranted, is one of the more useful habits buried inside this whole idea of expanding what counts as realistic. Here's a useful test. Small thinkers ask, "How do I get by?" Big thinkers ask, "How do I make an actual difference?" Small thinkers ask, "What's the minimum I can do to not fail?" Big thinkers ask, "What's the maximum version of this I'm capable of?" Notice that neither question is about fantasy. Both are grounded, practical questions. The only difference is the size of the lens each question is asked through. Think of it like a camera. Most people go through life with the lens cropped in tight, only seeing the narrow frame directly in front of them. This month's bills, this year's job title, this circle of friends' definition of success. Widening that lens doesn't make the picture less real. It just lets more of the actual world into the frame, including opportunities that were always there but were previously cropped out of view. Every major achievement you can name started as a thought inside one ordinary person's head, before there was any evidence it would work. The first airplane was a thought before it was a machine. Every business you've ever used started as an idea someone had while still working a job that had nothing to do with it. None of the people behind those ideas were operating with more raw talent than the people around them who dismissed the same idea as unrealistic. They just refused to let a small thought define the ceiling of what they attempted. Here's a piece worth adding to that observation, since it's tempting to file it under those people were just different. The people behind those ideas weren't operating without doubt, and they weren't surrounded exclusively by supportive believers either. Most of them had people close to them offering the exact same, let's be realistic caution described earlier in this chapter, often from people who genuinely cared about them and were trying to prevent disappointment. The difference wasn't the absence of that caution. It was a decision made repeatedly, to weigh their own working assumption about what was possible more heavily than the borrowed caution of people who hadn't actually tested the idea themselves. Here's the closing thought worth carrying out of this chapter specifically. Expanding your definition of realistic doesn't require certainty that a bigger goal will work out. It only requires being honest about the difference between a goal that's genuinely impossible and one that's simply been labeled that way by people, including yourself, who never actually tested it against reality directly. Imagine two versions of your next 12 months laid out side by side. One where you keep your goals exactly the size they are right now, safe, familiar, unlikely to disappoint anyone including yourself. The other where you set one goal that's genuinely a little uncomfortable to say out loud. Which 12 months actually changes your life? Which one 5 years from now do you think you'll be glad you chose? None of this works, though, without a mindset shift in how you talk to yourself day to day. Replace "I hope" with "I will." Replace "maybe" with "definitely." Small language keeps producing small commitment, because your brain takes cues from the words you use about your own future just as much as it takes cues from actual evidence. And here's where it gets useful. Surrounding yourself with people who already think in a wider frame tends to widen yours by proximity, almost without effort. The energy and expectations of the people closest to you become the invisible ceiling or floor of what feels normal to attempt. That's worth paying attention to, because it means your environment is either quietly stretching your definition of realistic or quietly shrinking it, whether you've noticed or not. It's worth pausing on why realistic feels so persuasive in the moment it's said, even though it usually falls apart under closer inspection. Part of it is that the word borrows credibility from math and science, fields where being realistic genuinely matters, and applies that same weight to something far more subjective, a prediction about a specific person's future capability. Nobody can actually run the experiment of what would happen if this person tried without them trying. So every claim of unrealistic, made before an attempt, isn't really a measurement. It's a guess dressed up in the language of measurement, and it tends to go unquestioned specifically because it sounds so measured. Here's a distinction that clarifies a lot. There's a real difference between a goal being difficult and a goal being impossible, and realistic thinking constantly blurs the two together. Difficult means it will cost real effort, real time, probably some failed attempts along the way. Impossible means the laws of physics or some hard external constraint genuinely rule it out. The overwhelming majority of goals people label unrealistic aren't impossible at all. They're just difficult, and difficult gets rebranded as impossible specifically because difficult requires something the person isn't yet willing to commit to giving. Think about how this plays out with something as ordinary as switching careers later in life. On paper, someone with 15 years in one field pivoting into something unrelated looks, to an outside observer applying the realistic filter, like a long shot. But break it down into what's actually required: learning new skills, which is genuinely learnable at any age, building a new network, which happens through repeated ordinary effort, and tolerating a period of being a beginner again, which is uncomfortable but not remotely impossible. None of the individual steps are unrealistic. The whole thing only looks unrealistic when it's evaluated as one enormous leap instead of a sequence of ordinary doable steps. This points to something practical. Big thinking doesn't actually require ignoring the size of the goal. It requires refusing to let the size of the goal be evaluated all at once, in a single glance, which is exactly how the word unrealistic tends to get applied. Break the same goal into its component steps and the unrealistic label almost always quietly disappears, because no individual step was ever actually unreasonable. It was only the compressed, all-at-once framing that made it look that way. Here's another layer worth adding to the camera lens idea from earlier. A cropped lens doesn't just hide opportunities that exist outside the frame, it also hides the actual size of obstacles inside the frame, distorting them to look larger than they are, because there's nothing else in view to compare them against. Widen the frame, and a problem that looked enormous when it was the only thing you could see often turns out to be one manageable piece among several, once it's seen in proper proportion next to everything else that's also true about your situation. There's one more thing worth naming about who tends to hand out the word realistic most freely, because it's rarely random. It tends to come loudest from people who are close enough to you to feel invested in the outcome, but who have themselves already settled into a fixed idea of what's possible for people in your position. That's not usually malicious. Often it's protective. They've seen disappointment before, maybe their own, and they genuinely don't want to watch you experience it too. But protective and accurate aren't the same thing, and it's worth separating the two before absorbing the advice as fact. A parent who never pursued a creative field themselves cautioning you against one isn't necessarily wrong about the risks, but they're also speaking from a position that never actually tested whether it was possible, only assumed it wasn't and never checked. Here's a useful filter for sorting realistic-sounding advice going forward. Does this person's caution come from direct, tested experience with a specific thing I'm attempting, or from a general, untested assumption about what people like me tend to be capable of? The first kind of caution is worth taking seriously. It's earned. The second kind is worth noting and setting aside, not because the person means any harm, but because an untested assumption doesn't actually carry the weight it sounds like it carries in the moment it's delivered. There's a second filter worth applying alongside the first, since not all tested experience transfers cleanly either. Even genuinely earned caution was earned under a specific set of conditions, a specific market, a specific decade, a specific starting point, and those conditions don't always still apply. Someone who tried something similar 15 years ago and watched it fail isn't necessarily wrong about the difficulty, but the landscape they were operating in may no longer resemble the one you'd actually be stepping into. Worth asking before fully absorbing even earned caution: is this person describing a fixed law about the attempt itself, or a specific outcome from a specific set of conditions that may no longer hold? Imagine sitting down this week and taking one goal you've quietly filed under not realistic for someone like me, and breaking it into 5 ordinary steps, none of which on its own would strike anyone as an unreasonable ask. What does the goal look like once it's no longer one giant leap, but 5 specific, doable Tuesdays? But widening your thinking is only step 1. The moment you set a goal even slightly bigger than what feels comfortable, something predictable happens. Your brain immediately starts generating reasons why it can't be done. Those reasons feel completely logical in the moment. They almost never are. And understanding exactly how that mental defense mechanism operates is the next piece of this puzzle. Chapter 3. The disguise fear wears. Excusitis. There's a specific mental pattern that quietly kills more ambitious plans than any external circumstance ever does. And it has a name worth knowing: excusitis. It's the habit of manufacturing a logical-sounding reason not to attempt something, a reason convincing enough that you never even notice it's an excuse. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like honesty. Excusitis shows up in a handful of very recognizable disguises, and once you can name them, you'll start catching them everywhere, including in your own head. There's health excusitis. I'd chase this goal, but my energy just isn't where it needs to be right now. There's age excusitis, which somehow shows up on both ends. I'm too young, nobody would take me seriously, or I'm too old, that ship has sailed. There's intelligence excusitis. I'm just not built for that kind of thing. Some people are, and I'm not one of them. And there's luck excusitis, maybe the most comfortable one of all. Some people just get the right breaks. I wasn't born under that kind of star. Here's a specific reason naming these disguises explicitly, rather than just describing excusitis generically, actually matters in practice. A named pattern is far easier to catch in the moment than a vague, unnamed feeling. If you've never specifically labeled age excusitis as a recognizable pattern, the thought "I'm too old for this now" just feels like an ordinary, unremarkable observation about yourself, easy to accept without questioning. Once it has a name, and once you've seen it described as a common, predictable pattern rather than a unique personal insight, it becomes noticeably easier to recognize the thought for what it actually is the next time it shows up, rather than mistaking it for a fresh, credible piece of self-knowledge. Notice what all four of these have in common. They all locate the obstacle somewhere permanent and outside your control. Your age, your intelligence, your luck, your health. These all sound like fixed facts rather than choices, which is exactly what makes them so effective as excuses. A fixed fact can't be argued with. It lets you off the hook completely, and it does it before you've even had the discomfort of trying and possibly falling short. There's a fifth, less commonly named version worth adding to the list, since it shows up constantly in ordinary, everyday form: circumstance excusitis, the belief that your specific situation, your city, your industry, your family responsibilities, is uniquely unsuited to the kind of attempt you're considering, in a way other people's situations apparently aren't. This one is particularly convincing because the specific circumstance is usually real. What's exaggerated isn't the circumstance itself, it's the conclusion drawn from it, that this particular real constraint rules out the entire attempt, rather than simply shaping what the attempt needs to look like given the constraint. Here's the part that's uncomfortable to sit with. Excuses aren't lies, exactly. They're usually built around a real detail. Maybe your energy genuinely isn't at its best right now. Maybe you genuinely didn't grow up with connections in the field you want to enter. The excuse doesn't require a false fact. It just requires taking a real, minor obstacle and inflating it into a disqualifying one. That's the actual mechanism, not fabrication, exaggeration. Every person you consider successful has felt the exact same doubts you feel. That's not a comforting cliché, it's a specific, checkable claim, and it holds up. The people who eventually built something real didn't have a version of themselves with less fear. They had a version of themselves that moved forward while the fear was still present, instead of waiting for it to disappear first, because it never fully disappears first for anyone. Here's a reason this specific claim is worth checking rather than just accepting on faith. Ask nearly anyone who's built something you admire about their own doubts along the way, and if they're being honest rather than performing a polished origin story, the doubts are almost always there, described in detail, often more vividly remembered than the eventual success itself. The absence of visible doubt in most success stories isn't evidence the doubt wasn't present. It's usually just evidence that the doubt didn't make it into the final edited version of the story, the same way the messy first drafts rarely make it into the finished product. Think about it like a locked door with an alarm attached to it. Most people assume the alarm has to stop before they're allowed to open the door. But the alarm is wired to the door itself. It doesn't stop until you actually push through. Waiting for the fear to quiet down before acting is like standing in front of that door hoping the alarm turns off on its own. It won't. The only way to silence it is to move. There's a reason this specific image, the alarm wired to the door rather than to something separate from it, matters more than it first appears to. It reframes the fear itself as information about proximity to something meaningful, rather than as a signal to retreat. A quiet hallway with no doors worth opening doesn't need an alarm system at all. There's nothing there worth protecting or guarding. Here's a small practical test worth applying to any excuse before accepting it. Would you accept this exact same reasoning from a close friend who came to you with the identical situation, or would you immediately spot the excuse in their version and gently push back on it? Most people are dramatically better at identifying excusitis in someone else's story than in their own, because the emotional stakes and self-protection instincts that cloud the judgment in the first person simply aren't present when you're just listening to a friend. Running your own excuse through that specific filter, imagining a friend saying the exact same thing to you, tends to expose weak excuses far faster than examining them directly. There's a final layer worth adding here, because excusitis doesn't only show up before an attempt, it also shows up afterward, reshaping how a result gets interpreted once it's already happened. A mediocre first attempt at something new gets filed by an excusitis-prone mind as proof the whole thing was a bad idea from the start, rather than as an entirely normal first attempt at something unfamiliar. That reframe after the fact is just as damaging as the reframe beforehand, because it closes the door on a second attempt using the exact same borrowed authority the original excuse used to avoid the first one. Watching for excusitis doesn't stop the moment you've taken the action. The reason waiting doesn't work is mechanical, not mystical. Fear, left alone with nothing but your imagination to feed it, doesn't shrink over time. It grows because your brain, given no new information, defaults to filling in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. The longer you sit with an undone hard thing, the more elaborate and convincing the imagined disaster becomes, purely because you've given your mind more uninterrupted time to build it. Here's a useful way to picture why this specific growth pattern happens. An unresolved decision behaves a little like an open tab left running in the background of your attention, quietly consuming a small amount of mental bandwidth at all times, even when you're consciously focused on something else entirely. Every time your attention brushes past that open tab, even briefly, it gets a small update, usually in the direction of more concern rather than less, since idle, undirected thinking about a feared outcome rarely produces reassurance on its own. Closing the tab, taking the actual action, whatever the outcome turns out to be, is the only way to stop that background drain, because a resolved fact simply doesn't require the same ongoing attention an open, unresolved question does. Action interrupts that loop the moment it happens, because it replaces imagined outcomes with real information. You send the email you were dreading, and within minutes the fear has nothing left to attach itself to, because the uncertain thing is no longer uncertain. It's just a fact now, handled or not, but no longer looming. There's a specific reason the imagined version is almost always worse than what actually happens, and it's worth understanding rather than just noting as a curiosity. Imagination, left unconstrained by real feedback, tends to generate the single worst plausible outcome and then treat it as the most likely one, simply because a vivid, dramatic scenario captures more attention than a mundane, boring one, and attention is what gets treated as significant. Reality, once you actually act, is rarely dramatic in either direction. Most hard conversations produce an outcome closer to mildly awkward than catastrophic, but mildly awkward doesn't generate the same intensity of imagined dread, so it almost never gets pictured in advance. The gap between the imagined worst case and the actual, boring outcome is where most of the unnecessary suffering and delay actually lives. Think about the first time you did almost anything unfamiliar. Driving for the first time. Speaking in front of a group for the first time. Starting a new job where you didn't know anyone. In every case, the nervousness was sharpest in the minutes before you started, not during, and definitely not after. The moment you were actually doing the thing, your attention shifted from the abstract fear to the concrete task in front of you, and the fear had nowhere left to live. This is why the standard advice to build confidence first gets the sequence backwards. Confidence isn't a prerequisite for action. It's a byproduct of it. Every rep of doing something uncomfortable and surviving it becomes a small piece of evidence your brain files away, and confidence is really just the accumulated weight of that evidence over time. You don't feel ready and then act. You act, not fully ready, and the acting is what eventually produces the feeling of readiness. Here's a specific consequence of this reversal that's worth naming, because it changes how you should think about timing. If confidence follows action rather than preceding it, then waiting for a future moment when you'll finally feel ready enough to start is, structurally, waiting for something that can only... The readiness has to be built, and building starts with the exact same uncomfortable first step regardless of which month it happens in, which means postponing rarely makes the eventual first step any easier. It just delays when the readiness starts accumulating. Here's a useful reframe to try the next time fear shows up before a decision. Instead of asking, "What if I fail?" ask, "What if this actually works?" Your brain is wired with a strong default bias toward imagining worst-case outcomes, because historically that bias kept your ancestors alive. But you can deliberately point that same imaginative capacity toward the version where things go well, and the vivid detail matters here, not vague optimism, but specific, concrete imagery of the successful outcome. That doesn't erase risk. It just stops the risk from being the only picture your brain is allowed to paint. Here's why forcing this specific reframe matters, more than simply telling yourself to relax or stop worrying. Trying to switch off worry directly rarely works, because you're fighting the brain's default wiring head-on, which tends to backfire and make the worry more insistent. Redirecting that same imaginative machinery toward a different, equally vivid target works with the wiring instead of against it. You're not asking the brain to stop generating detailed pictures of the future, something it's going to keep doing regardless. You're simply choosing which picture gets the detail. Imagine the next uncomfortable conversation or decision on your list right now. What if, instead of waiting to feel ready for it, you simply treated the discomfort as expected background noise rather than a stop sign? What would this week look like if you moved through 3 small uncomfortable actions instead of 0, purely because you'd stopped requiring yourself to feel fearless first? There's a specific reason this reversal, act first, feel confident later, is so hard to accept even once you understand it intellectually. It goes against how emotions normally seem to work in every other part of life. Usually you feel hungry, then you eat. You feel tired, then you rest. The feeling seems to lead and the action seems to follow, so it's natural to assume courage should work the same way. Feel brave, then act bravely. But courage isn't actually a feeling you wait to arrive. It's closer to a decision you make while the fear is still fully present. And mistaking it for a feeling you're supposed to wait for is exactly what keeps people stuck indefinitely, waiting for a sensation that was never going to show up on its own. Here's a way to test this against your own memory. Think of the last time you felt a genuine wave of relief after doing something you've been dreading, a hard conversation, a difficult phone call, a decision you've been putting off. Notice when the relief actually arrived. It's almost never before the action. It's almost always immediately after, sometimes within seconds of finishing. That timing alone is worth paying attention to, because it directly contradicts the assumption that you need to feel better first in order to act. The feeling better was downstream of the acting the entire time. There's also a specific trap worth naming here: mistaking rumination for preparation. It's easy to convince yourself that thinking through a hard decision one more time, running the scenario in your head again, is productive, responsible groundwork. Sometimes it genuinely is, early on. But past a certain point, usually reached far sooner than people admit, additional thinking stops adding new information and starts just re-triggering the same fear response on a loop, without moving anything forward. The tell is simple: if another round of thinking about it hasn't produced a single new fact or option in the last few days, it's no longer preparation. It's just rehearsing the fear. Think about how this shows up with something as ordinary as a difficult text message or email you've been sitting on. The first draft in your head, the one you compose mentally over and over without sending, tends to get more anxious and more overthought with each replay, not less. But the moment you actually type something reasonable and hit send, the anxious loop breaks immediately, regardless of how the other person eventually responds, because the uncertainty that was fueling the loop is now resolved. The response might still be disappointing, but the specific fear of what if I never send it and it just sits there is gone the second you act, and that particular relief has nothing to do with the outcome at all. Here's a specific, usable version of the "what if this works" reframe. Instead of a vague pep talk, try picturing the successful outcome in enough concrete detail that it has actual texture: what you'd say next, how the other person's face might look, what you'd do in the hour right after it went well. Vagueness doesn't compete effectively with a vivid, detailed fear. Vagueness needs to be replaced with an equally vivid, detailed alternative, or the fear wins by default simply because it's the more detailed picture available. Imagine picking one thing you've been mentally rehearsing instead of doing, something that's had more thinking time than it's earned by now. What would happen if you gave yourself a hard deadline today, not next week, to simply act on it, badly or imperfectly if necessary, and let the fear catch up to reality instead of staying ahead of it? Here's one more piece worth adding on the topic of fear specifically, because it clarifies why "just do it scared" isn't reckless advice. It's actually the more accurate description of how nearly every meaningful action has ever been taken. Almost nobody who's ever done something genuinely difficult reports having felt calm and fully ready beforehand. What they report, almost universally, is doing it anyway, with the fear still present, and discovering afterward that the fear didn't actually prevent them from functioning, it just made the experience less comfortable along the way. That's a very different claim than "fear disappears once you're brave enough." It's closer to "fear was never actually a barrier to the action, it just felt like one until the action happened despite it." Think about the specific relief that shows up not from the outcome going well, but simply from the waiting being over. There's a version of anxiety that's entirely about uncertainty itself, separate from whatever the uncertain thing actually turns out to be. The moment that uncertainty resolves, whether the news is good or bad, that specific flavor of anxiety drops immediately, because it was never really about the outcome, it was about not knowing. This is worth remembering the next time you're delaying something specifically because you're afraid of a bad outcome, since delaying doesn't actually protect you from that outcome, it just extends the specific discomfort of not knowing, on top of whatever the eventual outcome turns out to be anyway. There's a practical way to use this specifically for decisions you keep circling without resolving. Give the decision an artificial but firm deadline, a specific day and time by which you will have acted, regardless of whether you feel fully ready by then. The deadline does something the open-ended version of the decision never does. It converts an abstract, indefinitely postponable fear into a concrete, time-bound task, and concrete, time-bound tasks are far easier for the brain to actually execute than vague ones that could technically happen any day, which in practice tends to mean no day in particular. There's one more small but useful tactic worth naming here, specifically for the moment right before acting, when the resistance is at its peak. Rather than trying to talk yourself into feeling ready, which rarely works in that specific window, simply shrink the action down to the smallest physically possible first step: opening the document, dialing the number, drafting one sentence of the email rather than the whole thing. The smaller first step is easier to start precisely because it barely resembles the intimidating whole task in your head, and starting, even on the smallest possible scale, tends to carry its own momentum into the fuller action once you're already moving. And here's the piece that matters most going forward. This isn't a one-time trick you use for a single big decision. It's a habit you build through repetition, the same way any skill gets built, through small, consistent reps rather than one dramatic leap. Which naturally leads to the next question worth answering. If confidence really is built through repeated action rather than granted all at once, what does that building process actually look like in practice day to day? Chapter 5. Confidence is built. It's never just handed to you. There's a quiet myth a lot of people carry around without examining it. The idea that some people are simply born confident, and everyone else is stuck watching from the outside. It feels true because confident people make it look effortless. But confidence isn't a trait some people are issued at birth. It's closer to a skill, and skills are built through repetition, not luck of the draw. Here's a reason this myth survives despite being so easy to disprove with a little digging. Confidence, once built, tends to erase the memory of its own construction. Ask someone who genuinely comes across as confident today about their first attempt at the thing they're now confident in, and the story almost always includes an awkward, uncertain beginning that's easy to forget once enough successful reps have piled on top of it. The finished result looks effortless partly because the effortful, uncomfortable early stage is no longer visible, not because it never happened. Here's the actual sequence, and it's the opposite of what most people assume. People think confidence comes first, and then action naturally follows once you've got enough of it stored up. But it works the other direction. You act, often without feeling ready, and the confidence shows up afterward, as a direct result of having acted. Confidence isn't the starting fuel. It's the exhaust that gets produced once the engine's already running. Here's a specific reason this sequence is so counterintuitive that even people who intellectually accept it still struggle to act on it consistently. Culturally, confidence gets portrayed almost exclusively in its finished form. A speaker who's clearly comfortable on stage, an entrepreneur who's clearly at ease describing their business. What almost never gets shown is the specific, unglamorous middle stretch where that same person was still visibly uncomfortable but doing it anyway, because the finished, confident version is simply more watchable and more shareable than the awkward middle. The result is a skewed sample of what confidence actually looks like in progress, one that makes the uncomfortable middle stretch feel like a sign something's wrong, when it's actually just the normal, necessary, and completely unremarkable phase everyone passes through on the way to the version that eventually gets shown. Think of confidence the way you'd think of a muscle rather than a personality trait. Nobody expects to walk into a gym once and walk out with visible strength. Strength accumulates through repeated, sometimes uncomfortable reps, and it's the exact same mechanism with confidence. Every time you choose to step into something that makes you a little uneasy and come out the other side having survived it, that's one rep. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to happen, and it needs to happen again. There's a specific reason the muscle comparison holds up better than most people expect, and it's worth pushing a little further than the metaphor level. Muscle doesn't grow during the lift itself. It grows during the recovery afterward, when the tissue rebuilds slightly stronger than it was before. Confidence appears to work on a similar delayed schedule. The moment right after a hard rep, right after the uncomfortable meeting or the difficult ask, rarely feels like a triumphant surge of new confidence. It often just feels like relief or exhaustion, or nothing dramatic at all. The actual gain shows up later, quietly, the next time a similar situation comes up, and it registers as slightly less threatening than it used to, without you necessarily noticing the exact moment that shift happened. This is why the advice to aim for progress, not perfection, isn't just a nice sentiment. It's genuinely the more effective strategy. If public speaking makes you nervous, The goal isn't to become a polished speaker overnight. It's to speak up once in one meeting. Confidence as a word implies a feeling, something that's either present or absent in a given moment, which makes it feel unreliable, since feelings fluctuate constantly regardless of actual capability. Trust implies something closer to a track record, evidence accumulated over time that you'll show up and handle what comes, even on days when the feeling of confidence happens to be low. You can act with self-trust on a day when you don't feel confident at all, because trust isn't asking you to feel a certain way first. It's simply asking you to rely on the accumulated evidence that you've handled discomfort before and survived it. Here's a detail that gets overlooked constantly. Most people only celebrate the big, obvious wins, and skip past the small ones entirely, treating them as too minor to count. But the small moments are actually where the real confidence gets built, because they're the ones that happen far more often. The time you spoke up despite feeling nervous. The time you sent the message you'd been avoiding. Acknowledging that kind of small courage, instead of dismissing it as not a big deal, reinforces the exact belief you're trying to build, that you can handle discomfort and come out fine on the other side. Imagine tracking just one thing this week. Every moment you did something slightly uncomfortable and it turned out okay. Not perfect, not impressive to anyone else, just okay. What would that list look like by Friday? And what would it start to prove to you about what you're actually capable of handling, that you currently assume you're not? Here's the piece worth remembering above all else. The people who come across as naturally confident aren't fearless. They've simply logged enough reps of acting despite fear that trusting themselves to figure it out has become the default, rather than the exception. That trust doesn't come from thinking about action. It only comes from doing it, repeatedly, in small doses, until it stops feeling like a leap and starts feeling like a habit. Here's a detail worth adding to the muscle analogy, because it clarifies something people often get wrong when they try to build confidence intentionally. Nobody builds real strength by only ever lifting the exact same light weight, week after week, never adding anything. There has to be a small, deliberate increase over time, or the muscle plateaus and stops adapting. Confidence works the same way. Repeating the exact same comfortable but slightly uncomfortable action forever eventually stops producing new confidence, because your nervous system adapts to it and it stops being a genuine stretch. The specific action that builds confidence today needs to get incrementally bigger over time, or the growth quietly stalls out even though you're still technically doing the work. This is worth being honest about, because a lot of people build a small comfort zone around a slightly expanded version of their old comfort zone, and then stop, mistaking that first expansion for the whole project. Speaking up once in a meeting is a genuine, real step. But if speaking up once becomes the permanent ceiling, repeated identically for the next 2 years, the confidence built from that first rep eventually flattens out, because the nervous system stops registering it as a stretch. The goal isn't to find one comfortable-sized challenge and repeat it forever. It's to keep nudging the edge slightly further out, the same way a weight gets slightly heavier over months, not because more is inherently better, but because growth specifically requires the edge to keep moving. Here's a distinction worth making between two very different reasons people avoid tracking small wins. Some people skip it because they think it's unnecessary, that confidence should just show up naturally without needing to be documented or noticed. Others skip it because quietly, they don't actually believe the small win counted, that speaking up once in a meeting was too minor to matter compared to what real confident people supposedly do. That second reason is worth catching specifically, because it's excusitis wearing yet another disguise, this time aimed at your own evidence rather than at the goal itself. Discounting your own small wins as too small to count is just another way of protecting the belief that you're not yet the kind of person who's allowed to feel confident. Think about how this plays out with something like public speaking specifically, since it's one of the more universally uncomfortable examples. Nobody goes from silent in meetings to comfortable on a stage in one leap, and expecting that leap is exactly what causes most people to quit after one bad attempt. But going from never speaking up in a meeting straight to volunteering for a major public presentation skips so many intermediate steps that a failure at that scale can actually reinforce the original fear rather than dismantle it, teaching the nervous system that speaking up genuinely is dangerous rather than teaching it that speaking up is survivable. The increments need to be large enough to count as genuine stretches, but small enough that even a rough attempt still counts as a survivable rep rather than a confirming disaster. Finding that specific size, uncomfortable but not overwhelming, is closer to an ongoing calibration than a formula, and it's worth adjusting based on how the last rep actually felt rather than assuming the same size increase works for every stage. Think about how this calibration plays out over a longer stretch of time rather than a single week. Early on, the stretch might be as small as asking one clarifying question out loud in a meeting where you'd normally stay silent. A few months later, once that no longer feels like a stretch at all, the next size up might be offering a full opinion unprompted. Later still, it might be leading a small portion of the meeting yourself. None of these steps, viewed individually, look dramatic. But strung together over a year, they produce someone who can walk into a room and speak with genuine ease. And that person didn't get there through one bold leap. They got there through a long sequence of correctly sized reps, each one only slightly harder than the last. There's also a specific setback worth preparing for in advance, since it will happen at some point in this process regardless of how well calibrated the increments are, an attempt that genuinely doesn't go well. A missed shot, a flat presentation, a conversation that landed badly. The instinct in that moment is to treat the setback as evidence the whole approach was wrong. It rarely is. One rough rep inside a long sequence of otherwise steady progress is just noise, not a verdict, and treating it as a verdict is often the single moment where people quietly stop the whole process rather than simply absorbing the one bad rep and continuing. But confidence built through action still needs something to run on day to day, some underlying current that either amplifies it or quietly drains it before it has a chance to build. That current is attitude, and it turns out to matter a lot more than most people give it credit for. Chapter 6. Attitude is the lens your entire world gets filtered through. Here's a claim worth testing against your own experience. Success doesn't start with skill, and it doesn't start with luck either. It starts with the quality of your everyday mental attitude, because attitude is what determines whether your skill and your opportunities actually get used or quietly wasted. The mechanism is simple but easy to underestimate. The way you think shapes how you feel. How you feel shapes how you act. And how you act is the only part of that chain anyone else, including opportunities and other people, ever actually sees or responds to. A brilliant plan carried out with a negative, defeated attitude tends to fall flat, not because the plan was bad, but because the energy behind its execution undercuts it at every step. Here's a specific reason this chain matters more in practice than it does in theory. Nobody around you actually has access to your internal thought process. They only ever see the last link in the chain, the action, the tone, the follow-through, or the lack of it. Which means two people can hold identical plans and identical skill levels, and still be judged completely differently by everyone around them, purely based on how that invisible internal chain happened to translate into visible behavior. Attitude isn't just an internal experience you're managing for your own sake. It's effectively the only part of your thinking anyone else ever gets to evaluate you on, whether that feels fair or not. It's worth being precise about where in that chain most people try to intervene, because it's usually the least effective point. Most advice about attitude targets the feeling directly, telling you to simply feel more positive, which rarely works on command, because feelings don't respond well to direct instruction. The more reliable lever is further upstream, at the level of thought, specifically which thought you choose to keep attending to once several have already crossed your mind. You can't force a feeling to change instantly. You can, with practice, redirect which thought gets the next few seconds of your attention, and the feeling tends to follow that redirection a moment later, rather than the other way around. Think about the people you genuinely enjoy being around. There's a strong chance they share one thing in common. They radiate a kind of steady, grounded, positive energy, not fake enthusiasm, just an underlying sense that things are workable. That's not incidental. Positive people tend to create environments where ideas actually get explored rather than shut down before they're even finished being said out loud. Negativity does the opposite. It makes every obstacle look bigger than it actually is, and every opportunity look smaller and more suspicious than it actually is. Here's a specific reason negativity has this exaggerating effect on obstacles, worth understanding rather than just accepting anecdotally. A negative frame tends to narrow attention specifically toward what could go wrong, which means, by simple volume, more attention ends up allocated to risk than to opportunity in any given situation, regardless of the actual ratio between the two. It's not that negative people see obstacles that positive people miss entirely. Both usually notice the same obstacle. It's that the negative frame gives that obstacle a disproportionate share of total attention relative to everything else also true about the situation, which makes it feel, subjectively, far larger than its actual weight in the full picture would justify. Here's a genuinely useful way to think about it. Two people can face an identical setback, a canceled deal, a rejected pitch, a missed opportunity. One treats it as evidence the whole plan was doomed. The other treats it as a detour information, a redirect toward something better. The external event was identical in both cases. The only variable that changed the outcome was the lens each person viewed it through. This isn't about pretending problems don't exist or forcing a smile through genuine hardship. It's specifically about where you choose to direct your attention once a problem is already in front of you. Instead of "this is too hard," try "this is where I actually grow." Instead of "I failed," try "I now know what doesn't work," which narrows the field. That's not softening reality. It's redirecting your brain toward the part of reality that's actually useful to you going forward. There's a specific reason this redirect works better as a practice skill than as a one-time decision, worth naming clearly. The first time you try to reframe a setback mid-frustration, it tends to feel forced, almost fake, because the old, more automatic interpretation still has more neural traffic running through it out of sheer habit. That awkwardness in the early attempts isn't a sign the technique doesn't work. It's simply what any new mental habit feels like before repetition smooths it out. The 10th time you catch yourself mid-setback and redirect, it feels noticeably more natural than the first time did, not because the setback got any smaller, but because the redirect itself has become a more worn, more accessible path for your attention to travel down. Here's a small daily practice worth trying. Start each day by asking one simple question: what's good about today? Before the day has even had a chance to answer that for you. It sounds almost too small to matter, but it trains your attention to actively scan for possibility instead of defaulting to scanning for problems. And that scanning habit compounds heavily over weeks and months. Imagine two versions of you walking into the exact same difficult week. Same deadlines, same setbacks, same uncertainty. One version treats every obstacle as proof that things are falling apart. The other treats the same obstacles as simply the price of doing something worth doing. Which version makes better decisions by Friday? Which version do other people actually want to work alongside? People are consistently drawn toward positive energy, whether they consciously notice it or not. It shows up in who gets hired, who gets recommended, who gets a second chance when something goes wrong. A steady, grounded attitude doesn't just feel better internally, it changes the actual outcomes available to you externally, because people respond to it and open doors because of it. Here's a piece worth being precise about, because attitude gets misunderstood in both directions constantly. It's not about suppressing genuine negative emotion or performing happiness you don't actually feel. That kind of forced positivity tends to be exhausting and, worse, tends to get seen through by the people around you fairly quickly. What actually matters is where your attention lands once a real difficulty is already acknowledged. You can fully admit a situation is hard, disappointing, even genuinely unfair, and still choose where your attention goes next, toward what's now unfixable and worth dwelling on, or toward what's still within your control and worth acting on. That choice of where attention goes next is the entire mechanism. It's not about denying the setback happened. Think about how differently the same piece of feedback lands depending on the attitude someone brings to receiving it. Two people get the identical critical note on a project they worked hard on. One hears it and immediately starts building a case for why the feedback is unfair, or the other person doesn't understand the constraints they were working under. The feedback gets rejected before it's even been fully considered, and nothing about the work improves as a result. The other person feels the same initial sting, that part isn't optional or avoidable, but then asks what's actually usable in the note, even if the delivery wasn't perfect. Same feedback, same sting, completely different outcome 6 months later, purely because of what happened with their attention in the first 30 seconds after hearing it. Here's a specific habit worth building around setbacks, since they're where attitude actually gets tested, not during the easy stretches. When something goes wrong, there's a brief window, usually just a few minutes, where the story you tell yourself about what just happened gets set. Once that story sets, it tends to calcify and become what happened, even if a more accurate or more useful version was available in that same window. Catching that window and deliberately choosing the more useful framing, this is a redirect rather than a dead end, is far easier to do in the first few minutes than it is to undo weeks later once the less useful version has already hardened into your default account of events. There's also a compounding effect worth naming specifically. A single instance of choosing a more useful attitude toward one setback doesn't change much on its own. But attitude, like belief, runs in the background across hundreds of small moments a week that never individually feel significant enough to matter. An unanswered email, a minor disagreement, a plan that shifted last minute. Across enough of those small moments, a consistently steadier attitude produces a visibly different trajectory than a consistently reactive one, even though no single moment in either trajectory looked dramatic at the time. Here's a way to make that compounding effect feel less abstract. Picture two people responding to the same category of minor daily friction: a delayed reply, a small scheduling conflict, an unexpected extra task, roughly 5 times a week, every week for a year. That's over 250 small moments where an attitude choice quietly gets made. Even a modest difference in how those 250 moments get handled, slightly steadier versus slightly more reactive each time, adds up to a genuinely large gap by the end of the year, not because any single moment mattered much, but because 250 repetitions of almost anything eventually produces a visible difference. Here's one more piece worth including, because attitude tends to get treated as a purely internal, private matter, something that only affects how you personally feel. It doesn't stay contained that way. Attitude leaks into tone, body language, word choice, and pacing in ways that are almost impossible to fully mask, which means the people around you are picking up on your underlying attitude constantly, whether or not you've said anything explicit about how you're feeling. A team member operating from a defeated, resigned attitude tends to subtly lower the energy of an entire room, even while saying all the technically correct things. A team member operating from a steady, workable attitude tends to raise it, for the same reason. That ripple effect is worth factoring in, because it means attitude was never actually a purely private choice with no external consequence. It's one of the more visible signals you're constantly broadcasting, whether you intend to or not. Imagine picking one recurring source of minor frustration in your week right now, something small and repeated rather than a single dramatic event. What would it look like to deliberately practice the redirect specifically on that recurring frustration for the next 2 weeks? Not because the frustration itself is important, but because it's frequent enough to actually build the habit on. Here's one more distinction worth making before moving on, because attitude and honesty sometimes get treated as though they're intention, as if a positive attitude requires glossing over real problems. They're not actually intention. A genuinely useful attitude names the problem accurately, sometimes more bluntly than a negative attitude would, precisely because it isn't spending energy avoiding or minimizing it. What it doesn't do is stop at naming the problem. It moves immediately to what's workable from there. The difference isn't how honestly the problem gets described. It's whether the description is the final word or simply the starting point. But attitude alone, without direction, just makes you a pleasant person standing still. The next piece is what actually turns that energy into forward motion. Specific, well-set goals, and the kind of creative thinking that finds a way to reach them even when the obvious path is blocked. Chapter 7. Goals turn big thinking into something you can actually build. Big thinking without a specific goal attached to it is really just an elaborate form of daydreaming. It feels good in the moment, but it doesn't move anywhere on its own. What separates people who actually build something from people who just talk about building something isn't the size of the idea. It's whether that idea got translated into a specific, concrete goal. Here's a distinction worth making early, since the words big idea and big goal tend to get used interchangeably even though they're doing different jobs. An idea is a direction, a general sense of what you'd like more of in your life. A goal is a destination with a shape specific enough that you'd actually recognize the moment you arrived at it. Plenty of people carry genuinely big ideas around for years without ever converting a single one into a goal with that kind of recognizable shape, and the idea stays exactly as exciting and exactly as motionless the entire time, because excitement was never the missing ingredient. Specificity was. Think of a goal as something closer to a GPS destination than a vague hope. A hope tells your mind nothing actionable. A specific goal tells your brain exactly where to point its attention, and just as importantly, it tells your brain what to start filtering out as irrelevant noise. That filtering function matters more than people realize, because most of us are surrounded by far more distraction and opportunity than we could ever act on. And a clear goal is what decides what gets through the filter. Here's a piece worth adding to the GPS comparison, since it clarifies something people often skip. A GPS needs a starting point just as much as it needs a destination, and most people are far more precise about the destination than they are about honestly naming where they're currently starting from. Vague optimism about your current starting point, overestimating skills you haven't actually tested yet, or underestimating resources you already have, throws off the entire route calculation just as badly as a vague destination would. An honest, specific accounting of where you're actually starting from isn't pessimism, it's simply the other half of the coordinates the whole plan depends on. Here's a detail worth catching though. It's tempting to set goals that are comfortably within reach, because they feel achievable and safe. But a goal that doesn't stretch you even slightly, that doesn't make you a little nervous to say out loud, usually isn't doing its actual job. If a goal doesn't excite you or unsettle you at least a little, there's a decent chance it's sized for your comfort rather than sized for your growth. Once a big goal is actually set, the real work becomes figuring out how to reach it, and this is where most people quietly give up before they've even started, because the obvious path looks blocked. This is exactly where creative thinking earns its place. Instead of asking, "Can this be done?" which tends to produce a fast, defensive, "probably not," the more useful question is, "How could this be done?" which forces your brain into a completely different mode, one that generates options instead of shutting the door. Here's a reason those two questions produce such different results despite looking similar on the surface. Can this be done is a yes or no question, and the brain, given a yes or no framing under any kind of uncertainty, tends to default toward the safer, more defensible answer, which is usually no, since no rarely gets challenged the way a confident yes would. How could this be done isn't a yes or no question at all. It doesn't have a single. There's a reason this exercise specifically requires a fixed number 10, rather than an open-ended brainstorm a few ideas instruction, worth understanding. An open-ended instruction lets your brain stop the moment it produces something adequate, which is usually far too early. A fixed, slightly uncomfortable number forces continuation past the point where the obvious answers run out, and it's specifically that forced continuation, not the brainstorming itself, that produces the more original later entries. The number isn't arbitrary. It's doing the actual work of pushing past the easy stopping point. Think about how this plays out practically. Someone wants to build an audience for a small business, but assumes they need a large ad budget they don't have. The obvious path is blocked. But the how could this be done question opens up other paths. Partnering with someone who already has the audience, creating something genuinely useful that gets shared organically, showing up consistently in one specific community rather than trying to be everywhere at once. None of these require the blocked resource. They just require the willingness to keep generating options instead of stopping at the first dead end. There's another piece worth adding here. Visualize the completed goal in specific, vivid detail before you've achieved it. Then work backward from that picture to map the steps. This isn't about wishful thinking, it's a practical planning tool. When your mind has a genuinely clear picture of the destination, it becomes noticeably better at recognizing relevant opportunities along the way, almost like it's now actively looking for a specific shape instead of scanning randomly. Here's a distinction worth adding to the GPS analogy, because it's easy to set a destination and still go nowhere if the destination is described too vaguely to actually navigate toward. Get better at my job isn't a destination a GPS could route to. Get promoted to team lead within 18 months is. The difference isn't ambition. Both could reflect the exact same underlying desire. The difference is specificity. And specificity is what actually lets your brain start filtering daily decisions against it. A vague goal produces vague filtering, which in practice means almost nothing gets filtered at all, and you end up reacting to whatever's loudest each day instead of moving toward anything in particular. There's a specific reason people resist making goals this specific, and it's worth naming honestly. A vague goal is comfortable precisely because it can't be missed. If the goal is simply do well, there's no clear moment where you fail to hit it, which feels safer. A specific goal, get promoted within 18 months, creates the possibility of a clear, visible miss, and that possibility is uncomfortable enough that a lot of people quietly prefer the vague version, even though the vague version is far less likely to actually produce the outcome they want. Specificity isn't just a planning technique. It requires a small amount of courage, because it makes the goal falsifiable. Think about the how could this be done reframe applied to something very ordinary. Wanting to build a genuine professional network in a new city where you don't know anyone. The blocked path version of this goal assumes you need an existing connection to get anywhere, an assumption that immediately makes the goal feel stuck. The how could this be done version generates a different list entirely. Attending one relevant event a month regardless of not knowing anyone there yet, reaching out directly to a handful of people doing interesting work and asking for a short conversation, volunteering for something visible in a relevant community. None of these require the missing resource, an existing connection, that made the goal feel blocked in the first place. They just require generating enough options that the missing resource stops being the only path forward. Here's a specific trap worth flagging in the 10 ideas exercise. Stopping the list the moment a comfortable, familiar idea shows up, because it feels like relief to finally have something to write down. That relief is worth noticing and resisting, at least until the full 10 are actually written, because the first comfortable idea on the list is rarely the most effective one. It's just the one that required the least creative effort to produce. The ideas worth paying closest attention to tend to show up later on the list, after the easy, obvious options have already been used up and your brain is forced to actually stretch to keep generating. There's also something worth saying about visualizing the completed goal that goes beyond simple motivation. When the destination is pictured in genuinely specific detail, your brain becomes measurably better at what researchers sometimes call selective attention, noticing relevant information in your environment that would otherwise pass by unnoticed. This isn't mystical. It's the same reason someone who just bought a particular car model suddenly starts noticing that exact model everywhere on the road, not because more of them appeared overnight, but because their attention is now tuned to that specific pattern. A specific, vividly pictured goal tunes your attention the same way, toward opportunities relevant to that goal that a vaguer goal would have let slide by unnoticed. Here's a way to actually use this, rather than just find it interesting. When you picture the completed goal, don't stop at the outcome itself. Extend the visualization slightly further into the specific, small, ordinary actions that would have had to happen along the way to get there. The conversations, the practice sessions, the unglamorous prep work. A vivid picture of only the finish line tunes your attention toward recognizing the finish line when it arrives, which is useful but incomplete. A vivid picture that includes the ordinary steps along the way tunes your attention toward recognizing those steps as they show up in your actual daily life, right now, long before the destination is anywhere close to visible. Here's a final piece worth adding on the topic of tracking progress toward a specific goal, since setting the goal well is only half the work. Progress toward a genuinely ambitious goal is rarely linear or evenly paced, which catches a lot of people off guard and makes them abandon a perfectly good goal midway, mistaking a normal plateau for evidence the whole thing isn't working. Building in a specific scheduled check-in, monthly rather than daily, where the only question is, am I meaningfully closer than I was last time I checked, tends to smooth out that panic, because it evaluates progress over a long enough window to actually see it, rather than judging the goal against the noisy, inconsistent progress of any single week. Imagine picking one goal right now that currently feels a little out of reach, and instead of asking whether it's realistic, simply asking how 10 different people might approach getting there. What's the first idea on that list that you haven't tried yet, purely because you assumed it wouldn't work without ever actually testing it? Goals aren't limited to career or money either. They apply just as directly to relationships, health, personal growth, any area where you're willing to define what more specifically looks like. Every time you write a concrete goal down instead of leaving it as a vague hope, you're essentially signing a private agreement with yourself to grow past your current edge. And that agreement, once it exists in specific enough terms, starts pulling your daily decisions toward it almost automatically. There's one more piece worth adding here, since it's easy to treat a written goal as a static document you set once and check periodically. A goal worth pursuing over a long stretch of time usually needs to be revisited and re-specified as circumstances change, not abandoned when the original version stops fitting perfectly, but adjusted, the way a route gets recalculated mid-trip when a road turns out to be closed, without ever questioning whether the destination itself was worth driving to in the first place. Here's a distinction worth keeping in mind while making that kind of adjustment. Revising the route is not the same as quietly shrinking the destination. It's tempting, especially after a difficult stretch, to blur the two together, to tell yourself you're simply being flexible about the path when what's actually happening is the goal itself is being lowered to something safer. Worth periodically asking honestly whether a given adjustment is genuinely a smarter route to the same destination, or a smaller destination dressed up as a smarter route. But no goal gets reached in isolation, and this next part is where a lot of otherwise capable big-thinking people quietly undercut themselves without realizing it, by treating success as something they're building entirely alone. Here's why that support tends to stay invisible in most retellings of a success story, worth naming plainly. A story about one determined individual overcoming the odds is simply a cleaner, more compelling narrative than a story about a determined individual who also happened to have 3 specific people quietly help at 3 specific moments along the way. The second version is usually closer to what actually happened, but it doesn't compress into a tidy headline as easily, so it tends to get edited out, not out of dishonesty exactly, just out of narrative convenience. Worth remembering the next time a solo achievement story feels intimidating in its apparent self-sufficiency. The visible version is almost always a simplified edit of a more collaborative reality. This changes what thinking big actually means in practice. It's not only about the size of what you personally achieve. It's about your capacity to lift other people up along the way, because those two things turn out to be far more connected than most people assume. Genuine leadership, in this sense, has very little to do with authority or a title. It starts with something much simpler: how you actually treat the people around you day to day. Most environments, once you're actually inside them working, turn out to be less zero-sum than they appeared from the outside looking in. And the people who assume otherwise from the start tend to miss the collaborative opportunities that would have made the scarcity less severe in the first place. Here's the distinction worth noticing. People who think small tend to operate from a scarcity mindset around credit and recognition, which shows up as criticizing others, gossiping, or quietly competing out of insecurity, because on some level they've assumed there's only so much success available and someone else succeeding means less is left for them. People who think big operate from the opposite assumption. But noticing which one shows up first, honestly, is a far more accurate read on which mindset is actually running underneath than anything you'd consciously claim to believe about yourself. Think about the single best mentor or leader you've personally had. There's a good chance they didn't just hand you instructions and walk away. They made you believe, through how they treated you, that you were capable of more than you currently thought you were. That belief, coming from someone else, has a way of becoming contagious, almost like it gets loaned to you until your own belief catches up to match it. Here's a small, specific practice worth adopting. Make it a genuine daily habit to express real, specific appreciation. Not generic compliments, but actual acknowledgement of effort, even when the results attached to that effort aren't perfect yet. This costs you almost nothing in time or resources, but it has a disproportionate effect on how motivated and capable the other person feels afterward, and that shift tends to come back around toward you in ways that are hard to predict in advance. Here's why the timing of that appreciation matters almost as much as the content. Praise offered only after a final result lands, once success is already obvious and undeniable, is easy to give and correspondingly cheap in its effect, because it required no real generosity. The outcome had already made the case on its own. Appreciation offered mid-process, before the outcome is settled, while the person genuinely doesn't yet know if the effort will pay off, carries far more weight, because it demonstrates belief in them rather than simply agreement with a result that's already visible to everyone. There's also a specific pattern worth watching in how you talk about people who aren't in the room. Big thinkers tend to speak well of others by default, not out of naivety, but because they understand that words genuinely carry energy, and that energy circulates. Speaking well of someone, even when they're not present to hear it, tends to build the kind of trust and goodwill that eventually finds its way back to you through channels you never directly controlled. Here's a distinction worth drawing out, because leadership tends to get mentally filed under job titles: managers, executives, people with direct reports. But the version worth paying attention to here has nothing to do with an org chart. It's the influence you have on how capable the people around you feel, regardless of whether you have any formal authority over them at all. A friend who consistently makes you feel like your ideas are worth taking seriously is exercising this kind of leadership just as much as anyone with a title, arguably more, because there's no positional pressure making you listen to them. You listen because of how they've made you feel about your own thinking over time. Think about the scarcity mindset pattern a little more closely, because it's worth understanding why it feels so intuitively correct, even though it tends to produce worse outcomes for the person operating from it. If credit and recognition genuinely were a fixed pie, protecting your slice by minimizing others would make complete sense. The problem is that in most real environments, recognition isn't actually fixed. Teams that collaborate well tend to produce more visible wins overall, which means more recognition circulating for everyone involved, not less. The scarcity assumption isn't just unkind, it's frequently just factually wrong about how the underlying system actually works, and operating from a wrong assumption tends to produce worse results even on the scarcity mindset's own terms. Here's a specific pattern worth watching for in yourself: the instinct to quietly downplay someone else's contribution when retelling a story about a shared success. It's subtle, and it rarely feels like an active choice. It just happens in how the story gets told, whose part gets emphasized and whose gets glossed over. But that instinct, left unchecked, tends to erode trust faster than almost anything else, because people notice, even when they don't say anything about it. The corrective habit is equally subtle, deliberately naming someone else's specific contribution out loud, especially in moments where it would have been easy to just let your own part stand alone. Here's why this particular correction matters more than it might seem in the moment. There's a particular version of this worth applying directly to a faceless, content-based context, since it's easy to assume that building something solo, without a visible team, removes the relationship piece entirely. It doesn't. It just moves it. The audience relationship, how genuinely you engage with comments, how much you credit sources and inspirations honestly, how you talk about competitors or other creators in the same space, all of it is still leadership in exactly the sense being described here, just directed at a different kind of group than a traditional team. Here's a small, specific practice worth adopting beyond generic appreciation: naming the specific mechanism behind why something someone did worked well, rather than offering only a general compliment. Good job registers and fades quickly. The way you framed that pushback made it land without anyone getting defensive. That's a specific skill registers differently, because it identifies something repeatable that the person can consciously do again. Specific acknowledgement tends to reinforce the exact behavior worth reinforcing, in a way vague praise rarely manages to do. Here's why the specificity itself does most of the work, worth spelling out plainly. A vague compliment tells someone they did well, but it doesn't tell them what to keep doing, which means it can't actually be repeated on purpose the next time a similar situation comes up. A specific one hands them a small, usable piece of self-knowledge. This particular approach worked. Worth trying again, which is a fundamentally more useful gift than the vague version, even though both take roughly the same few seconds to say out loud. Here's a final piece worth naming, because it's easy to assume this kind of generosity only matters once you've already achieved something worth sharing. It doesn't work that way. The habit of genuinely believing in other people's potential and saying so out loud is built the same incremental way every other habit in this script gets built, through small, repeated reps, starting well before you've achieved anything that would make you feel qualified to be generous with recognition. Waiting until you feel successful enough to start lifting others up gets the order backwards in exactly the same way waiting to feel confident before acting does. The habit has to start now, at whatever stage you're currently at, or it never actually starts at all. Imagine the specific people in your life right now: coworkers, friends, family, an audience if you have one. In what ways are you already leading them, whether you've labeled it that way or not? And is the version of leadership you're currently offering coming from a place of genuine belief in their potential, or from a place of quiet fear about your own position? Here's the reframe worth carrying forward. Thinking big was never only about the size of your personal outcome. At its core, it's about the size of the impact you're willing to have on your own life and on the people whose paths cross yours along the way. Supporting someone else's growth as fiercely as you protect your own tends to produce something bigger than either person could have built alone. There's a longer-term payoff to this worth naming plainly, since generosity toward others can sound, on the surface, like it's asking you to sacrifice something for their benefit. In practice, over a long enough timeline, it rarely works that way. People remember, specifically and accurately, who believed in them before there was clear evidence to justify it, and that memory tends to translate into real support later, in forms that are impossible to predict or plan for in advance. It's not a transaction, and treating it as one defeats the purpose. But it's worth knowing that the generosity was never actually a cost with no return. It just pays out on a timeline too long and too indirect for most people to consciously connect the two. But none of it means anything if it doesn't actually become a repeatable daily habit, rather than a burst of motivation that fades in a week. That's the piece worth closing on. Chapter 9. Making this an actual daily habit. Not a temporary burst of motivation. Here's a pattern worth being honest about. Big ideas are easy to get excited about for a day or two. The genuine challenge has never been understanding this material. It's carrying it into a random Tuesday 3 weeks from now, when the initial spark has faded and it's just you, a normal to-do list, and the same old comfortable defaults quietly calling you back. Here's a reason that specific random Tuesday deserves more attention than the exciting first day ever gets. The first day after encountering a genuinely compelling idea runs on borrowed energy. The novelty of the idea itself is doing most of the work, and almost anyone can look consistent for a day or two under those conditions. The random Tuesday 3 weeks out has none of that borrowed energy left. Whatever shows up that day is running purely on whatever structure got built in the meantime, not on excitement. Which means that unremarkable Tuesday, not the exciting first day, is actually the more honest test of whether any of this has genuinely taken hold. Real change was never built in a single dramatic moment of motivation. It gets built in the small, boring, repeated choices you make on ordinary days when nobody's watching and nothing particularly exciting is happening. Big thinking has to become a lifestyle you default into, not a mood you occasionally visit when you happen to feel inspired. Here's a specific reason lifestyle is the more accurate word than mindset for what's actually being described here. A mindset sounds like something you either have or don't have on a given day, which quietly implies that a bad day disproves the whole project. A lifestyle is built from repeated behavior over time, and a single bad day inside a generally consistent lifestyle doesn't undo the lifestyle, the same way one skipped workout doesn't undo months of training. Framing this as a lifestyle rather than a mood removes a huge amount of unnecessary pressure to perform it perfectly every single day, which, ironically, tends to make it far more sustainable over the long run than the all-or-nothing version most people attempt first. Here's where to actually start, and it's smaller than you'd expect. Pay attention to what you feed your mind in the first few minutes of your day, because those first few minutes tend to set the tone for everything that follows. Reaching for your phone and scrolling straight into other people's noise and negativity first thing is a specific choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. Spending even a few minutes instead picturing yourself actually working through your current goals, in specific, vivid detail, functions like a kind of mental rehearsal, priming your brain to act in alignment with where you're actually trying to go. There's a reason the first few minutes carry disproportionate weight compared to, say, the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Right after waking, the mind hasn't yet been filled with the day's specific demands and reactions, which means whatever gets fed into it first has an unusually clear run at setting the baseline tone for everything that follows. Feed it someone else's outrage or someone else's highlight reel, and the baseline gets set by comparison and reaction. Feed it a specific, calm picture of your own goals, and the baseline gets set by direction instead. The content of those first few minutes isn't a minor detail. It's closer to priming the entire operating system for the day ahead. The people you spend the most time around matter here more than most people are comfortable admitting. Energy is genuinely contagious, in both directions. Spend most of your time around people who default to complaining and playing it safe, and your own sense of what's normal to attempt starts quietly shrinking without you noticing the slide happening. Spend more time around people who default to building, trying, and believing things are workable, and that same contagion works in your favor instead. Being intentional about who you're closest to isn't shallow advice. It's one of the more direct levers available to you. Here's why this particular lever tends to get underused despite being so directly available. Changing your own habits feels effortful and requires constant, conscious maintenance. Adjusting who you spend the most unmonitored time around requires effort mainly at the point of the decision itself, and then largely runs on its own afterward, since you don't have to consciously choose the influence every single day the way you'd have to consciously choose a habit. It's less about willpower and more about a single upstream decision that then quietly does a lot of downstream work without needing to be revisited constantly. Here's a specific evening habit worth building. Take 5 minutes before the day ends and ask 2 direct questions. What did I actually do today that moved me closer to something I care about? And what would I adjust tomorrow based on that? This isn't about harsh self-judgment. It's a simple check-in that keeps your own growth visible to you in real time, instead of only noticing progress in hindsight, months later, if at all. Here's a reason this specific timing, at the end of the day rather than the start, tends to work better for this particular check-in than it might for other habits. Morning reflection has to compete with the day's incoming demands, which tend to crowd it out or rush it. An end-of-day reflection has the entire day's actual evidence already available to draw from, rather than asking you to predict or plan in the abstract. It's a naturally better moment for honest assessment than for motivation, and honest assessment, done consistently, tends to be the rarer and more valuable of the two. Think about how this applies even outside the obviously big decisions. Carrying yourself consistently like the version of you that you're actually building toward, in the small moments, is what makes that version feel less like a fantasy and more like an inevitable extension of who you already are. Here's a specific reason motivation-based change fails so predictably, worth understanding rather than just accepting as a known fact about willpower. Motivation is fundamentally a response to novelty and stakes. It spikes when something feels new or urgent and fades naturally as that thing becomes familiar, regardless of how important it actually is. That fade isn't a personal failure or a sign of weak discipline. It's just how motivation works as a mechanism. Which means building a system that depends on motivation staying high is building on a foundation that was never designed to hold steady in the first place. The fix isn't finding a way to keep motivation permanently elevated. That's not realistically achievable for anyone. The fix is designing habits simple and small enough that they don't actually require much motivation to execute on a low-energy day. Think about the specific difference between a habit that survives a bad week and one that doesn't. A habit that requires you to feel inspired, energized, and fully resourced to execute will reliably collapse the first time you have a genuinely rough week, and everyone has rough weeks. A habit scaled down to something you could technically do even on a bad day, 5 minutes of visualization instead of 30, one specific evening question instead of a full journaling session, survives precisely because it was never depending on your best possible state to begin with. The smaller, more boring version of the habit is usually the more durable one, even though it looks less impressive on paper. Here's a piece worth adding to the environment discussion, because it's easy to treat surround yourself with big thinkers as advice that requires a dramatic overhaul of your entire social circle, which makes it feel impractical and gets dismissed. It doesn't require that. It can be as specific as adjusting what you consume in idle moments. The podcasts playing in the background, the accounts you follow, the specific handful of people whose opinions you seek out when you're unsure about something. Environment isn't only about who's physically in the room. It's about which voices have consistent access to your attention across an ordinary week, and that's adjustable in far smaller, more immediate ways than changing your entire circle of friends. Here's a small practical audit worth running on that input list once. Honestly, go through the last handful of accounts, shows, or voices you spent real attention on this week and ask for each one, whether it left you feeling slightly more capable and clear-headed afterward, or slightly smaller and more anxious. Not everything needs to pass that test. Some input is just entertainment, and that's fine. But if the overall mix is heavily tilted toward the second category, that's worth adjusting deliberately, since it's quietly setting the baseline tone for a meaningful chunk of your week without ever announcing that it's doing so. There's a specific failure mode worth naming in the evening check-in habit, turning it into a self-criticism session instead of a genuine check-in. The question, "What would I adjust tomorrow?" is meant to be practical and forward-looking, not an invitation to relitigate every small mistake from the day in a harsh tone. If the evening habit starts to feel dreaded or heavy, it's worth checking whether it's still functioning. If it consistently leaves you feeling slightly deflated rather than simply informed, the habit has likely drifted from its intended shape and is worth resetting. Soften back toward genuine curiosity about tomorrow rather than judgment about today. Think about how the "carry yourself like the person you're building toward" idea applies to something as unglamorous as how you handle a single ordinary, low-stakes task this week, one nobody's currently watching or grading. The instinct in low-stakes moments is often to cut corners slightly, since apparently nothing's riding on it. But those exact moments are where the habit actually gets built or quietly eroded, because high-stakes moments are rare and low-stakes moments make up the overwhelming majority of any given week. The standard you hold yourself to when nobody's watching ends up being the actual standard, regardless of what higher standard you'd claim to hold when it counts. There's a specific reason low-stakes consistency matters more than most people expect, worth naming directly. High-stakes moments announce themselves in advance, which means it's relatively easy to rally extra effort specifically for them: a big presentation, an important meeting, a critical deadline. Here's a final, honest note worth ending on, because it's tempting to treat everything in this script as a checklist to master perfectly before it counts. It doesn't work that way, and expecting it to is its own version of excusitis, waiting to feel like you've fully mastered thinking big before you're allowed to claim you're doing it. Belief, action over comfort, a steady attitude, real goals, generosity toward others. None of these are switches that flip on permanently once triggered. They're daily choices, made imperfectly, abandoned some days and picked back up the next. And the picking back up is the actual skill worth building, far more than any single day of doing all of it flawlessly. Imagine tracking just one specific input this week: what you consume in your first 10 minutes awake and your last 10 minutes before sleep. What would shift over the course of a single month if both of those windows were pointed deliberately toward growth instead of left on autopilot? And finally, keep learning, deliberately and continuously. Read things that challenge your current thinking. Take in content that stretches your definition of what's normal to attempt. Every genuinely new idea widens your mental frame just slightly further than it was before, and that widening compounds over time in ways that are hard to notice week to week, but become obvious looking back a year later. Conclusion: so here's the actual shift worth taking from all of this. Thinking big was never about having it all figured out in advance, and it was never about being fearless. It's about believing in your own capability before you have the evidence to justify it, setting goals that genuinely stretch you instead of goals sized for your comfort, and taking consistent, unglamorous action on ordinary days rather than waiting for a burst of motivation to carry you. 9 ideas, one thread running through all of them. The gap between the people who build something real and everyone else was never as wide as it looks from the outside. It's rarely one dramatic advantage. It's a long series of small, repeatable choices: belief over evidence, action over waiting, a specific goal over a vague hope, that quietly compound into something that eventually looks, from a distance, like talent or luck, when it was mostly just consistency applied in the right direction for long enough. None of it happened overnight for anyone who's ever actually built something worth pointing to, and none of it needs to happen overnight for you either. None of the ideas in this one require a dramatic life overhaul starting tomorrow. They require noticing this week the specific moments where a realistic excuse shows up dressed as wisdom, and choosing just once to test it instead of accepting it automatically, without a second thought. That single shift, repeated often enough, is the entire mechanism behind everything covered here. Here's a direct challenge before you close this out. Then take the smallest possible first step toward it today, before the feeling of resolve has a chance to fade the way it usually does by tomorrow morning. If this actually shifted something for you, hit like and subscribe to Gollari Books so the next one finds you. And drop a comment. What's one goal you've been calling unrealistic that you're now willing to admit is just uncomfortable? Be specific. Don't just say a career change or starting a business. Name the actual thing. I'll be reading through them. See you in the next one.